As the protracted conflict in Ukraine enters its 1,204th day, a significant shift in international dynamics and a persistent evolving Russian strategy are shaping the battlefield and diplomatic landscape. Recent assessments from the Institute for the Study of War (ISW) highlight a critical crossroads marked by looming reductions in U.S. military aid and the Kremlin's unwavering commitment to its long-term objectives irrespective of the human cost. These developments underscore the complex interplay of military maneuvers, information warfare, and geopolitical posturing that continues to define the war. A pivotal concern emerged with U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's statement on June 10, indicating the United States' intention to reduce its budget for weapons purchases for Ukraine in 2026. While the extent of these planned cutbacks remains unspecified, Hegseth suggested that a negotiated peaceful settlement is in the best interest of all parties, acknowledging that the word victory, along with the path to victory and peace, has not been clearly defined. However, ISW analysts caution that such a reduction in military aid will neither foster sustainable peace nor compel Russian President Vladimir Putin to reconsider his theory of victory. This theory, as ISW assesses, posits that the Russian military can sustain incremental battlefield advances longer than Ukrainian forces can defend and longer than Western nations are willing to provide support. A reduction in U.S. aid therefore risks granting Russia a greater battlefield advantage, potentially emboldening Putin to prolong the conflict and reinforce his belief in Russia's ability to conquer Ukraine, an outcome incompatible with stated U.S. goals for enduring peace. Concurrently, the Kremlin continues to wage a relentless rhetorical campaign attempting to undermine Ukraine's independent identity and its Western partnerships. Russian presidential aide Vladimir Medinsky, in an interview published on June 11, provocatively described the war as a conflict between two brothers, suggesting a shared language and culture, thereby denying Ukraine's distinct statehood. This narrative aligns with broader Kremlin efforts to portray Ukraine as lacking in independent identity, aiming for Ukraine's complete capitulation and the installation of a pro-Russian government. Echoing this, Russian State Duma chairperson Vyacheslav Volodin reiterated false claims regarding Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's illegitimacy, asserting that only the Ukrainian Verkhovna Rada holds legal authority. These narratives, ISW concludes, are very likely designed to create conditions for Russia to unilaterally withdraw from any future peace agreements and to reinforce its long-standing demand for regime change in Kyiv. Further demonstrating its intent to fracture Western support, Russian officials are increasingly advocating for an escalation of strike tactics against Ukraine. Medinsky warned the Wall Street Journal that a protracted war against Russia is unwinnable, citing historical precedents like Russia's 21-year conflict with Sweden in the 18th century, and threatened a response if Ukraine is driven by the national interests of others. Similarly, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov blamed European states for obstructing peace and pushing Ukraine to continue military operations, while Volodin directly linked German military support to the conflict with Germany. In a more alarming development, Russian State Duma Defense Committee First Deputy Chairperson Alexei Zhuravlev called for Russia to strike Ukraine with a second Orshnik intermediate-range nuclear-capable ballistic missile, implying an imminent launch. These statements are part of a calculated strategy by Kremlin officials to periodically threaten escalation while simultaneously accusing the West of escalating the conflict through military aid, all to deter further assistance to Ukraine and bolster Putin's theory of victory. Beyond the immediate conflict, Russian officials are actively promoting anti-NATO and anti-Western rhetoric, seemingly to prepare Russian society for a potential future confrontation with NATO. Ryabkov reiterated the Kremlin's long-standing grievance over NATO expansion, calling it an acute problem and a root cause of U.S.-Russia tensions, and reaffirmed Russia's December 2021 demand for a legally binding guarantee against further NATO expansion and long-range weapon deployment near its borders. Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova further exaggerated NATO's defensive measures in Eastern Europe, accusing NATO General Secretary Mark Rutte of attempting to intimidate NATO populations with claims of a Russian threat. This consistent anti-Western narrative serves to justify and consolidate domestic support for a prolonged war against Ukraine and to condition the Russian populace for broader geopolitical tensions. Amidst these diplomatic and rhetorical battles, Ukrainian forces continue to demonstrate their capability to strike deep into Russian territory, targeting critical military and defense industrial infrastructure. Overnight on June 10 to 11, Ukrainian forces conducted drone strikes against the Tambov gunpowder plant in Kotovsk, Tambov Oblast, a key subsidiary of the state-owned Rostec conglomerate that produces gunpowder and explosives for the Russian military, as well as the Buter-Lanovka airfield in Voronezh Oblast and an ammunition depot in Kursk Oblast. Geolocated footage confirms a large fire and secondary explosions at the Tambov plant, underscoring the effectiveness of these attacks. Additionally, Ukrainian forces struck a Russian base in Kulbaki, Kursk Oblast, reportedly targeting electronic warfare systems and drone jammers, highlighting a strategic focus on disrupting Russian technological capabilities. On the ground, the conflict remains dynamic. Ukrainian forces recently advanced near Borova, recapturing positions north of Lozova. Meanwhile, Russian forces have made confirmed advances near Chasiv-Yar, Toretsk, Pokrovsk and Novopavlivka, indicating continued pressure along the eastern front. Russian forces also continued ground assaults in Kursk and Sumy oblasts, with Russian officials like Alexei Zhuravlev stating goals of creating a 100-kilometer buffer zone in Sumy Oblast, albeit at a slow pace. The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that elements of its eastern and central groupings of forces reached the Donetsk-Dnipropetrovsk Oblast border, suggesting a multi-pronged offensive to push deeper into Ukrainian territory. Casualties remain high, with a Ukrainian brigade spokesperson reporting approximately 50,000 Russian personnel casualties, including 20,000 killed in action in fighting for Toretsk since July 2024. The skies over Ukraine also continue to be a battleground. On the night of June 10 to 11, Russian forces launched a significant wave of attacks, including one Iskander-M ballistic missile and 85 Shahid drones from multiple directions. While the Ukrainian forces successfully downed 49 of these drones, the strikes still caused considerable damage. Ukrainian officials reported hits on residential areas and civilian infrastructure in Kharkiv City and Odessa Oblast, a hospital in Chernihiv City, and critical energy infrastructure in Kherson Oblast, resulting in widespread power outages. Kharkiv City alone saw at least 64 civilians injured and 2 killed. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy also confirmed that Russia has utilized North Korean ballistic missiles in recent strikes and that North Korea now has access to Russian and Iranian drone technology, signaling deepening military cooperation between these nations. Further complicating the geopolitical landscape, Belarus continues to deepen its military cooperation with China. The Belarusian Ministry of Defense reported that its military academy head Major General Andrei Gorbatenko visited Beijing to sign an agreement to continue training Chinese military personnel in Belarus, a practice that has been ongoing since 1998. This collaboration highlights the broader realignment of global military alliances in the shadow of the ongoing conflict. As the war enters its 4th year, the unfolding events paint a picture of a conflict where military aid, information warfare, and strategic alliances are as crucial as battlefield gains. The interplay between Western support levels and Russia's persistent multifaceted objectives will undoubtedly dictate the future trajectory of the war, demanding constant vigilance and adaptation from all parties involved. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine has entered a new unsettling phase, marked by a dramatic escalation in aerial assaults and a shifting geopolitical landscape. As the war stretches into its 4th year, recent days have seen Russia unleash a barrage of sophisticated multi-pronged attacks, testing the limits of Ukraine's defenses and underscoring the conflict's evolving nature. The sheer scale and tactical diversity of these strikes suggest a terrifyingly simple new drone strategy from Moscow: higher, faster, more, as observed by Euromaidan Press. In the early hours of June 10, Ukraine's capital Kyiv endured one of the most intense aerial assaults since February 2022. A 5-hour onslaught involving over 300 drones, cruise missiles and ballistic missiles across 7 of the city's 10 districts. Ukrainian officials reported that the attack was designed to overwhelm air defense systems through sheer volume and tactical diversity. While casualties were relatively light in Kiev with 1 person killed and 4 injured, the strike inflicted significant damage on civilian infrastructure, including the historic St. Sophia Cathedral, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Concurrently, other Ukrainian cities faced similar devastation. Kharkiv was particularly hard hit by 17 attack drones, resulting in 3 deaths and 64 injuries, while critical energy infrastructure in Kherson Oblast was struck, leading to widespread power outages. Civilian infrastructure in Odessa and a hospital in Chernihiv also sustained damage. The arsenal deployed by Russia in these recent attacks highlights a deliberate strategy of combining low-cost expendable drones with more advanced, difficult-to-intercept missile systems. The primary drones used were the Iranian-made Shahed-136 and Shahed-131 loitering munitions, often dubbed kamikaze drones, which are notoriously challenging to detect and intercept due to their low-altitude, unpredictable flight paths and a cost-effectiveness of approximately $20,000 per unit. These were complemented by Iskander-M ballistic missiles, known for their short range and in-flight maneuvering capabilities, and Kh-101 air-launched cruise missiles, stealthy long-range weapons that can adjust their routes mid-flight using GPS and inertial navigation. This blend of capabilities is clearly aimed at exhausting Ukraine's interceptor stockpiles and exploiting any gaps in radar coverage. Despite the intensity of the barrages, Ukraine's Ministry of Defense announced a remarkable success rate, having intercepted 277 out of 315 aerial threats, an 88% interception rate. This resilience is largely attributed to Ukraine's sophisticated air defense network, which integrates advanced Western systems like Iris-T NASAMS and Patriot missiles with legacy Soviet-era S-300 systems. Crucially, key infrastructure including Kiev's power grid and major hospitals remained operational during the attacks. However, Ukrainian defense officials have warned that such large-scale repeated assaults risk depleting missile defense stockpiles faster than they can be replenished, placing immense pressure on the system and a psychological strain on the civilian population. Adding to the complexity, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy reported on June 10 that Russia has used North Korean ballistic missiles in recent strikes and that Ukraine has observed evidence of North Korea now having access to Russian and Iranian drone technology, signaling a deepening of military cooperation between these nations. In a reciprocal move, Ukrainian forces have continued to target Russian military and defense industrial facilities deep within Russian territory. Overnight on June 10 to 11, Ukrainian drones struck the Tambov gunpowder plant, a key supplier of explosives for the Russian military, along with the Buter-Lanovka airfield in Voronezh Oblast and an ammunition depot in Kursk Oblast. Geolocated footage corroborated large fires and secondary explosions at the Tambov plant, a subsidiary of the state-owned defense conglomerate Rostec. Further strikes hit a Russian base in Kulbaki, Kursk Oblast, reportedly storing electronic warfare systems and drone jammers, showcasing Ukraine's ongoing efforts to degrade Russia's military capabilities and logistical support. Beyond the immediate battlefield, the conflict's trajectory is also being shaped by significant geopolitical and diplomatic developments. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth announced on June 10 the United States' intention to reduce its budget for weapons purchases for Ukraine in 2026 without specifying the extent of the cutbacks. Hegseth cited a negotiated peaceful settlement as being in the best interest of all parties, but acknowledged that the path to victory or peace remained undefined. The Institute for the Study of War (ISW) promptly assessed that such a reduction in U.S. military aid would neither lead to a sustainable peace nor compel Russian President Vladimir Putin to reassess his theory of victory, which posits that Russia can sustain incremental battlefield advances longer than Ukraine can defend or the West is willing to support Kyiv. ISW maintains that Western military aid, especially that which only the United States can provide rapidly and at scale, remains crucial for enabling decisive Ukrainian gains and forcing a change in Putin's calculus, thereby paving the way for constructive negotiations. The Kremlin, meanwhile, continues its rhetorical offensive, attempting to undermine Ukrainian sovereignty and unity while simultaneously intimidating Western partners. Russian presidential aide Vladimir Medinsky claimed the war was a conflict between two brothers. Consistent with the Kremlin's narrative denying an independent Ukrainian identity and statehood. This rhetoric, according to ISW, aims to set conditions for Russia to withdraw from future peace agreements and to support its long-standing demand for regime change in Kyiv. Russian officials are also actively working to rhetorically split Ukraine from its Western partners, with Medinsky claiming Russia always defeats its enemies in protracted wars and warning of Russian response if Ukraine is driven by the national interests of others. Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov blamed European states for pushing Ukraine to continue military operations, while State Duma chairperson Vyacheslav Volodin linked German military support to conflict with Germany. These statements are often accompanied by thinly veiled threats of escalation, such as First Deputy Chairperson Alexei Zhuravlev's call for a second Orshnik intermediate-range nuclear-capable ballistic missile strike on Ukraine. Furthermore, the Kremlin consistently promotes anti-NATO and anti-Western rhetoric, with Ryabkov reiterating that NATO expansion is a root cause of US-Russia contradictions and demanding a reduction in NATO's Eastern European contingent. This persistent narrative serves to justify and consolidate domestic support for a protracted war against Ukraine and to prepare the Russian populace for a potential future conflict against NATO. Amidst these broader strategic maneuvers, ground operations continue across the front lines. Ukrainian forces recently advanced near Borova, while Russian forces made incremental gains near Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, Pokrovsk, and Novopavlivka. In a rare positive development, Ukraine and Russia exchanged the bodies of killed in-action soldiers on June 11, with Ukraine receiving 12 bodies and Russia 27. However, Russian authorities have previously weaponized such exchanges to discredit Ukraine, underscoring the ongoing challenges in humanitarian efforts. In a separate development, Belarus continues to deepen military cooperation with China, with its military academy signing an agreement to continue training Chinese military personnel and enhance collaboration in this area, signaling broader strategic alignments. As the conflict grinds on, the intensification of aerial warfare coupled with Russia's evolving drone tactics presents a formidable challenge for Ukraine's defenses and its international partners. The delicate balance of military aid, the effectiveness of air defense systems, and the relentless diplomatic and rhetorical battles will all play a crucial role in shaping the war's future. The coming months will undoubtedly test Ukraine's resilience and the West's unwavering commitment to its sovereignty as the war continues to redefine modern conflict and international relations. The geopolitical landscape surrounding Russia and its assertive leader Vladimir Putin continues to evolve rapidly, marked by staggering human cost, escalating military posturing, and profound shifts in international relations. A stark new figure from the Hill, published on June 12, 2025, underscores the immense human toll of the ongoing conflict, reporting that Vladimir Putin has incurred 1 million casualties in what the publication terms his pointless war. This grim statistic serves as a harrowing reminder of the devastating human price paid in a conflict that has reverberated across continents. This escalating human tragedy is a significant driver behind the palpable nervousness gripping Europe, as detailed by KSNV on the same day. Veteran commentator Armstrong Williams, reporting from Paris, articulates the continent's deep preoccupation with Russia, specifically President Putin. Williams draws unsettling parallels between Putin and historical figures like Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, under whose rule historian Robert Conquest estimated no less than 20 million deaths, including up to 7 million from the Ukrainian Holodomor. This historical context frames Europe's current anxieties, suggesting a pattern of ruthless leadership. The article highlights a long list of alleged actions attributed to Putin that contribute to this perception, from the poisoning deaths of political opponents like Alexander Litvinenko and Alexei Navalny to the suspected orchestration of Yevgeny Prigozhin's plane crash. Furthermore, the downing of Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 over eastern Ukraine in July 2014, which the United Nations Aviation Agency determined was caused by a Russian-made missile killing all 298 people on board, is cited as another example of Putin's disregard for international norms.
Putin's naked aggression in annexing Crimea in 2014 and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 have sent tremors across Europe, leading many to view him as a modern-day Adolf Hitler. The perceived waning support from the United States, particularly under past rhetoric from figures like Donald Trump, who has reportedly expressed animosity towards Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and flirted with ending weapon flows, has fueled fears of a second edition of appeasement of Munich in 1938. Despite any reservations about Zelenskyy, Europeans unequivocally see Putin as vastly worse, a megalomaniac who covets all of Europe to restore the Russian Empire as it existed before 1917. This existential threat has spurred a significant reorientation in European defense strategy. NATO has expanded to 32 members, notably including Finland and Sweden, reflecting a unified front against perceived Russian expansionism. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer recently proposed the largest increase in UK defence spending since the Cold War, emphasising the need for warfighting readiness and acknowledging the undeniable threat Russia poses. This collective resolve underscores Europe's determination to avoid living under Putin's cruel heel. Adding to the global concern, Reuters reported on June 11, 2025 that Putin emphasized special attention should be paid to Russia's nuclear triad in its new arms program. This statement, focusing on strategic bombers, intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, directly elevates the specter of nuclear conflict and further compounds Europe's anxieties, reinforcing the perception of a leader willing to use all means to achieve his objectives. The explicit mention of tactical nuclear weapons threats against European countries assisting Ukraine further underscores the severity of this stance. Beyond the battlefield and diplomatic chambers, the economic fallout of Russia's actions continues to reshape its domestic landscape. The Financial Times revealed on June 12, 2025, that fake McDonald's, a rebranded Russian fast food chain that took over former McDonald's locations, is actively lobbying Vladimir Putin to block the return of Western companies. This development highlights the deep economic isolation Russia faces following the exodus of international businesses and its attempt to create a self-sufficient, domestically controlled economy. The lobbying effort reveals a desire to solidify the current economic reality, preventing a reversal of fortunes even if geopolitical tensions were to ease. It reflects a strategic move to entrench Russian alternatives and signals a long-term shift away from globalized economic integration, further isolating the nation from Western markets and capital. These disparate yet interconnected developments paint a complex picture of a nation increasingly isolated but defiantly pursuing its geopolitical ambitions, forcing the global community to continually reassess and adapt to a volatile new reality. The human cost of the conflict. The escalating military rhetoric, the profound reorientation of European defense, and the deliberate economic decoupling all point to a prolonged period of instability. As Europe bolsters its defenses and Russia doubles down on its military and economic autonomy, the trajectory of this evolving crisis will undoubtedly shape international relations and global security for decades to come, demanding sustained vigilance and strategic foresight from all stakeholders. As the protracted conflict in Ukraine enters another critical phase, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has intensified his appeals to the United States, asserting that Russia is actively misleading former now current U.S. President Donald Trump regarding the war's realities. In a candid interview with the Axel Springer Global Reporters Network this past Wednesday, Zelenskyy minced no words, stating Russia is simply lying to Trump, a sentiment he believes is shared by many world leaders. This pointed declaration underscores Kyiv's persistent belief that the leverage to end the devastating war largely rests with the American leader. Zelenskyy emphasized that President Trump holds immense power in shaping the conflict's trajectory, attributing this to Russia's perceived understanding of nothing but strength, a quality he unequivocally assigns to America. It's all in his hands, as Zelenskyy remarked, highlighting how the strength of sanctions packages and the speed of critical decisions are contingent on Trump's resolve. This perspective comes amidst a complex backdrop of U.S.-Ukraine relations under Trump's renewed presidency.
While a contentious Oval Office exchange in late February was acknowledged by Zelenskyy as not having brought the two nations closer, he noted a subsequent shift towards more constructive dialogue, including a friendly one-on-one conversation with Trump at the Vatican in April. Despite this renewed engagement, President Trump's approach to the conflict has been a source of both frustration and hope for Kyiv. While he has reportedly expressed exasperation with Russian recalcitrance and ongoing attacks, particularly after a recent phone call with President Putin, Trump has also famously compared Ukraine and Russia to two squabbling children. His claim that the deadline for imposing more sanctions on Moscow resides in his brain has left many observers, including Zelenskyy, uncertain about the immediate future of U.S. punitive measures. Nevertheless, Zelenskyy holds on to the belief that Trump is beginning to discern Russia's lack of sincerity regarding the war, noting Trump sees that the Russian side is not entirely honest about the war. Russia is not sincere. On the ground, the situation remains grim, with Russian forces continuing their offensive operations. However, Zelenskyy offered a nuanced assessment, stating that these efforts are, to put it mildly, not very successful, and that Moscow has yet to achieve its strategic aims. He characterized Russia as slowly bleeding out, with President Putin attempting to buy time as the Russian economy strains under the weight of the conflict. This analysis forms the basis of Ukraine's urgent plea for stronger sanctions, which Zelenskyy believes would further deplete Russia's arsenal and reduce attacks. He specifically advocated for stepping up sanctions against Russian oil, including a new price cap of $45 per barrel, a measure currently being discussed by the European Commission and hoped to be agreed upon by G7 countries at their upcoming summit in Alberta, Canada. Zelenskyy plans to attend this gathering, aiming to meet with President Trump to press for robust U.S. support for these critical economic measures. The human cost of the conflict continues to mount, with Ukrainian military figures estimating over 1 million Russian casualties, including killed and wounded, since the full-scale invasion began in February 2022. While Zelenskyy acknowledged that Russia appears indifferent to such massive human losses, he reiterated that economic pressure, particularly severe sanctions on oil, is what truly threatens Moscow and could compel them to seek peace. This call for increased economic leverage comes as Russia again pounded Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city, in overnight attacks, wounding at least 15 people, including children. Meanwhile, Ukraine continues to innovate its defense, exemplified by Operation Spiderweb, an unprecedented drone attack on Russian air bases. Zelenskyy stressed Ukraine's capacity to increase drone production but underscored the critical need for financing, warning that no country can afford to stay behind in technological developments. Amidst these military and economic pressures, direct peace negotiations, such as 2 rounds held in Istanbul, have yielded few substantial results aside from a series of prisoner exchanges which have seen hundreds of wounded and ill POWs return to their home countries. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius's recent visit to Kyiv further underscored European solidarity, with discussions focusing on continued weapons aid. As the conflict grinds on, Zelenskyy's leadership remains resolute. Despite admitting to personal moments of despair akin to Winston Churchill's struggles during World War II, he affirmed his unwavering public stance: "So until the end of the war I will never show any moments of weakness. And I will never share my dark days with anyone." The future of the conflict hinges on a complex interplay of military developments, the efficacy of international sanctions, and perhaps most critically, the evolving foreign policy posture of the United States under President Trump, whose perceived leverage could indeed prove decisive in bringing an end to the hostilities.